Hi students, for Module 4, or at the end of Module 4, you're going to be reading 3 paragraphs from Dr. King's famous I Have a Dream speech. And I wanted to take just a few minutes to go through those 3 paragraphs with you. Want to make sure that you understand what he's saying and that you have a little bit of context so that as you are finishing up this module, you can actually focus not so much on what Dr. King is saying, but on some of the strategies that he's using in order to persuade his audience. So let's take a look at these first 3 paragraphs here. Again, this is from the I Have a Dream speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The address is delivered at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That's in Washington, D.C., August 28th, 1963. It is worth noting that he is standing on the steps in front of the Lincoln Memorial. So what that means is there's a huge statue of Abraham Lincoln behind him. And so Dr. King and also President Lincoln are looking out to a crowd of about 250,000 people. When I say President Lincoln, I am referring to the statue, right? And Abraham Lincoln is long since passed in 1963, but there's that huge monument, that huge statue of him in Washington, D.C., and that is where Dr. King chose to deliver his speech. So that brings us to the first paragraph here, pretty straightforward greeting in which Dr. King says, "I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity." So a couple of things to note here. 50 years is 100 years. So Dr. King is really saying 100 years ago. He's using language here from Abraham Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address. So Dr. King is trying here to echo one of his heroes, Abraham Lincoln, by saying, or by using the phrase 50 years rather than simply saying 100 years ago. So that's the first thing to know. Next, great American here refers to Abraham Lincoln. And the Emancipation Proclamation is like an issue or an order to free slaves. So this was a famous proclamation or a famous order that Abraham Lincoln gave while he was president, and it began the process of freeing slaves, and a process that was continued with the Civil War and the outcome of the Civil War. All right, so if we look at that sentence, 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. In essence, Dr. King is saying 100 years ago, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, or he at least began that process to free the slaves. And the next sentence here, this momentous decree, that phrase refers back to the Emancipation Proclamation. So decree is like another word for issue or order or proclamation. All of those things mean the same thing, right? So here again, Dr. King is referring back to the Emancipation Proclamation. And then he's saying that that issue, that order to free slaves, came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves. And then you can go ahead and continue reading from there. And then in the last paragraph, and this is the paragraph that you'll be looking at most closely, the last paragraph, I should say, that you're going to read, obviously not the last paragraph in the speech. This last paragraph reads, "But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself an exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition, right? And that's where you'll stop reading. And I would strongly suggest that as you continue on to the assessment here, or as you continue on to the short written response, go ahead and make sure you read those 3 paragraphs from beginning to end so that you get the flow. And one last thing I'll point out here is that word segregation. It's a word that I assume many of you know already, but segregation was the practice of separating people. In America, it was specifically separating people by race, right? And the 2 sort of main races were white and black. And so segregation really refers in the southern United States to separating people by color. And that was perfectly legal at one point in time. It is not legal any longer, right? But this is why we had situations where we had schools that were, that served only white children, or we had schools that served only black children. You've maybe seen pictures of like water fountains that were labeled white and colored, right? So it was this idea that it was perfectly lawful to separate people based on their color, and to allow people to allow people of one race, or to limit where people of any race, I guess, could go. I'm going to end it there before I make this any worse or any more complicated than it actually is. I'm starting to sort of digress on a point that I think is not really that important to what you're about to do. If you have any questions about segregation, you can certainly do a quick Google search and you'll get a pretty good sense of what I am trying and sort of failing to explain. All right, but for this assignment, I think you have what you need. As always, if you have any questions, you're welcome to message me on Schoology, but hopefully this helps you to understand more or less what Dr. King is saying in these paragraphs. And then once you understand what he's saying, you can start to focus more on what he's actually doing. Like, what are some of these strategies that he's using? He's a really gifted speaker. He's very, very persuasive. So you can start to think about, like, what are these strategies that he's using, and why is he using them? Why does he think that they will help him to persuade the 250,000 people in front of him? And just to be clear, he's persuading those people to join him in fighting for the equal rights of all American citizens. So he needs their support, and he needs the pressure that they can exert on Congress, on the president, etc. He needs these people to get behind him so that they can get what they want, right? So again, ultimately, your job will be to think a little bit about, how does he do that? What sort of strategies does he use in order to get people to back him up in his quest and his mission to, to win equal rights for all?